People think the worst part of betrayal is the moment you catch them. They're wrong. The worst part is the second before you could have caught them, and chose not to. I was standing in my own hallway, jacket still on, one hand on the doorknob like a man who belonged there, when I heard my wife laugh. Not the polite laugh she used with neighbors. A quiet, private laugh. The kind you only give when you feel safe. Then I heard his voice. My best friend's voice. Come. Comfortable. Close. And in that second, something inside me shut down because my body understood the truth long before my pride was ready to name it. I didn't step forward. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't announce myself. I froze because I knew if I walked into that room, I wouldn't just see them together. I'd see how unnecessary I'd become. I'm telling you this as a man in his 60s because time doesn't erase that kind of moment. It only teaches you how to keep it from spilling out at the wrong people. Back then, I was the kind of husband everyone trusts. Dependable. Predictable. I fixed things before they broke. Paid bills early. Showed up when I was supposed to. I thought love was about being useful and quiet. He was my best friend since we were kids. We'd shared tools, secrets, and bad decisions. When I met my wife, he shook my hand like he was proud of me. When we bought our house, he helped move the couch and joked that it would outlast my marriage if I didn't learn to fold towels right. We laughed. I believed him. I believed both of them. Looking back, the signs weren't dramatic. That's what makes them dangerous. Her phone always face down. A new password she said she forgot to share. Errands that took longer than they used to. A little more perfume on days that didn't call for it. And every time my gut tried to warn me, I talked it down. She's tired. She's just helping. Don't be paranoid. Men like me don't want drama. We want our homes to keep standing. That night, rain canceled the job and sent me home early. I remember the wet smell of my jacket and the one loose floorboard near the coat closet. It always creaked. She used to tease me for never fixing it. Standing there, I realized that board had become a warning system. I stopped and held my breath. The house felt warmer than it should have, like it was holding something back. I heard a glass set down on the coffee table. Her laugh again. Then his voice, low and familiar, the way he used to talk when he settled in somewhere. And here's the choice that still wakes me up some nights. I could have pushed that door open. I could have demanded answers, forced them to look at what they were doing. I could have made a scene loud enough to justify my anger. Part of me wanted that because anger gives you a script. But another part of me, the part one don't like to admit exists, was terrified of what I'd see on their faces. Not shock. Not guilt. Relief. Relief that I'd finally arrived to play my role so they could stop pretending. And there was a thought that cut deeper than the betrayal itself, a thought I didn't tell anyone for years because it felt too shameful to say out loud. Maybe if I walked in, she wouldn't even stand up. That's when I knew I couldn't go in. Not because I was strong. Because I wasn't ready to see myself reduced to an inconvenience. So I did something that sounds weak when you say it plainly. I backed away. I eased the door shut without letting it click. I walked down the hallway like I was already a guest, careful not to step on that creaking board. Outside the air was cold and clean. It didn't care what was happening in my living room. I sat in my truck with both hands on the steering wheel, staring at the window with the drawn curtains. The light behind them was warm. Ordinary. Almost insulting. For a few minutes I tried to bargain with reality. Maybe I misheard. Maybe it was the TV. Maybe I was tired. Denial is a quiet kind of prayer. Then a shadow moved behind the curtain, two shapes crossing the room, and my stomach dropped so hard it felt like something inside me shifted out of place. I drove with no destination because sitting still felt dangerous. I ended up at a 24-hour diner off the highway, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who calls everyone Han. I ordered coffee I didn't taste and watched strangers live their normal lives. A couple argued over a check. A young guy laughed into his phone. A tired mother fed fries to a sleepy kid. And all I could think was, if I go back, what version of myself survives this? Do I beg? Do I threaten? Do I pretend nothing's changed? The truth men don't like to admit is that after betrayal, part of you wants the old life so badly you'd accept a humiliating version of it just to stay. I watched steam rise from my cup and realized I was afraid of two things at once. Afraid of losing her and afraid of learning she'd already let go. When the sky began to lighten, I went home. The driveway was empty. Inside, the house was quiet. She was asleep in our bed, alone, breathing slow and steady, like the world hadn't cracked open at all. She looked ordinary. That hurt more than rage would have. I stood there and felt something split inside me. Part of me wanted to lie down next to her and pretend, just for one more day, that I still belonged. Another part of me knew that if I did, I'd disappear in pieces so small no one would notice. Pride kept me standing. Love tried to pull me closer. I hated myself for how strong that pull still was. So I made a choice that didn't feel heroic. I didn't wake her. I went into the kitchen, took a yellow legal pad from the drawer, and wrote one sentence in my careful handwriting. We need to talk tonight. Not now. Tonight. I left it where she'd see it with her morning coffee. Then I showered, put on a clean shirt, and went to work, carrying the day like broken glass inside my chest. Every sound felt too loud. Every joke cut the wrong way. A coworker asked if I was okay, and I nodded because I didn't know how to explain that I'd walked out of my own house without knowing if I'd ever walk back in the same way. That evening, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table where we'd planned trips and talked about the future like it was guaranteed. She looked at me and understood the game was over. I didn't accuse her. I didn't present evidence. I asked one question, steady as I could make it. Is there something you need to tell me? She looked down. The silence answered before her words did. When she said my best friend's name, it landed in the room like a dropped tool, heavy, final. I expected anger. I expected shouting. What I felt was colder, smaller. Like I could be removed and nothing would stop working. If you've ever felt that cold, you know how dangerous it is. It makes you want to shrink quietly. It makes you wonder if you earned the erasure. I didn't earn it. But that night, I wasn't strong enough to believe that yet. I'm stopping here not because the story pauses, but because this is the moment everything began to tilt. What came next wasn't a fight or a clean break. It was slower, quieter, and it nearly finished me. If you think the hardest part was discovering the betrayal, you're wrong. The hardest part was what I did afterward, and why, 30 years later, they were the ones waiting for me to speak. I didn't fall apart the night I found out. That came later. What happened first was worse. I woke up the next morning and realized the world had decided to keep going without checking on me. The sun came through the blinds at the same angle. The coffee maker clicked on out of habit. Cars passed the house like nothing inside it mattered. That's the moment people don't warn you about. Not the explosion, the silence that follows, when you understand no one is coming to stop your life from continuing. I'm talking to you now because if you've ever lived long enough, you know this is how men disappear. Not loudly. Quietly. One normal morning at a time. After that night, things moved faster than my mind could keep up with. There were conversations that felt rehearsed on her side and improvised on mine. She cried once, carefully, like she was choosing the right place to do it. I remember noticing that detail and hating myself for noticing it all. My best friend didn't call. That hurt more than I expected. I kept thinking there would be some attempt, an explanation, an apology, even an argument. Nothing came. He vanished the way people do when they know they don't deserve to be seen. And what surprised me most was how quickly the world adjusted. Friends chose sides by choosing silence. Invitations slowed, then stopped. People didn't want the discomfort of the truth at their dinner tables. I don't blame them. I understand it now. But back then it felt like I'd been placed behind glass. Visible but inconvenient. The paperwork was efficient. That's the word I still use. Efficient. We divided things the way adults do when they're too tired to fight about objects. Furniture. Accounts. Tools I'd owned before the marriage and didn't bother to argue over because I didn't know how to argue without begging. We talked logistics, not reasons. And here's the part one don't like admitting. A small, weak part of me kept hoping she'd hesitate. That she'd say she wasn't sure. That she'd ask me to try harder. Men don't like to say this out loud, but sometimes we're not afraid of losing love. We're afraid of losing our role. I didn't know who I was if I wasn't her husband. The house felt wrong almost immediately. Rooms got bigger when they emptied. Sounds echoed longer. At night, I'd sit in the living room with the TV on low just to hear a human voice, even if it wasn't talking to me. I ate standing up because sitting at the table alone felt like admitting something permanent. I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because I didn't trust myself to stop if I started. Instead, I shrank. That's the only honest word for it. I started apologizing too much at work. Letting things slide that used to bother me. Saying it's fine when it wasn't until it became a reflex. And then there was the thought, the one that crept in late at night and made me stare at the ceiling. The thought men don't share because it feels like treason against your own spine. Maybe this happened because I wasn't enough. Not exciting enough. Not sharp enough. Not the man she needed anymore. I hated that thought. I argued with it. And still it stayed. One evening, a few weeks in, I stood in the kitchen holding a plate I didn't remember dirtying, and it hit me that no one was watching how I handled this. There was no audience. No scorekeeper. If I stopped trying tomorrow, nothing external would change. That realization is dangerous. It's where men either rebuild quietly, or give up just as quietly. I remember thinking, with a kind of exhausted clarity, I could let myself dissolve and no one would stop me. That scared me more than the betrayal ever did. I made a choice that night, not a noble one, just a stubborn one. I didn't decide to be happy. I didn't decide to forgive. I decided to stay visible to myself. I set an alarm even on days I didn't need to get up early. I shaved every morning. I showed up to work even when my chest felt hollow. Not because it fixed anything, but because routine was the only proof I had that I still existed. There were setbacks. Nights when I sat in the truck outside the house and wondered if I should drive somewhere and never come back. Moments when I imagined running into them together and rehearsed conversations I knew I'd never use. And there was one truth I couldn't escape. As long as I was waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, a collapse on their side, I wasn't living my own life. I was standing still while time passed judgment without me. I didn't get wiser overnight. I didn't feel proud. Most days I just felt tired. But slowly something shifted. Not in my heart, in my posture. I stopped checking my phone for messages that weren't coming. I stopped replaying the same arguments in my head. The ache didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. And that's when something else crept in, something I wasn't prepared for. A question I hadn't asked myself since I was young. If no one is choosing me right now, what would it look like if I chose myself anyway? That question didn't bring comfort. It brought fear. Because choosing yourself means giving up the hope that someone else will come back and make things right. It means accepting that the next chapter won't begin with closure, it will begin with you, alone, deciding to stand up. I'm ending here because this is where the real danger starts. Not the danger of heartbreak, but the danger of becoming a smaller version of yourself just to survive. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment I almost crossed that line, and the quiet, ordinary decision that pulled me back. I didn't almost ruin my life in a dramatic way. No bottles smashed. No shouting. No night in a holding cell. It was quieter than that, which is why it scared me later. I almost ruined it on a Tuesday evening, sitting alone in my truck, engine running, staring at my phone, wondering who I could call that would still pick up. That's how it starts for men my age. Not with a decision, but with a question you shouldn't be asking yourself. Who would notice if I disappeared for a while? I'm telling you this because people think survival looks brave. Most of the time it looks like sitting still, doing nothing because doing something feels too final. By then the paperwork was done. The house was no longer ours. My name was still on the mailbox, but it didn't feel like an invitation. I had moved into a small rental that smelled like old carpet and someone else's cooking. The first night there, I slept on the floor because the bed hadn't arrived yet, and I remember thinking how easy it would be to get used to less. That's the dangerous part, how quickly a man can adjust downward. Days passed. Then weeks. I went to work. I came home. I ate simple meals and washed one plate. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was hollow. And hollow spaces echo with thoughts you don't invite. I started driving more after dark. No reason. Just movement. Gas stations. Empty roads. The radio low like I didn't deserve company. One night I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. He looked older than he should have, thinner in places that weren't physical. And a thought slid in, unannounced and unwelcome. You could leave town and no one would chase you. That thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. That's what terrified me. I pulled over, shut off the engine, and sat there with my hands in my lap like a boy waiting to be told what to do. I didn't want to die. I want to be clear about that. What I wanted was to stop occupying space that felt borrowed. There's a difference, but it's a thin one. I thought about calling my ex-wife, not to argue, not to beg, just to hear a familiar voice say my name. I even scrolled to her number before stopping myself. The idea of hearing indifference on the other end felt worse than silence. Then I thought about calling him. My best friend. That thought was uglier. Not to confront him, but to ask something I hated myself for wanting to ask. Was it worth it? I sat there long enough for the dashboard lights to dim, phone still in my hand, and realized something that made my chest tighten. If I made either call, I would be asking permission to exist. And I wasn't sure I'd survive the answer. So I did nothing. I drove home. That night I lay on the floor of that empty apartment, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly, and understood how men slip out of their own lives without anyone pushing them. It doesn't take courage. It takes exhaustion. The next morning I woke up angry, not at them but at myself. Angry that I'd let two people determine how much space I was allowed to take up in the world. Angry that my worst moments were happening in private, where no one could stop me. I didn't decide to heal. I didn't decide to be strong. I decided something smaller and more stubborn. I decided I would not disappear quietly. That was it. No speeches. No promises. Just refusal. I started with physical proof. I bought a cheap chair and a small table for the apartment so I wouldn't keep eating off the counter like a man passing through. I unpacked boxes I'd been avoiding, even the ones with old photos I didn't want to see yet. I forced myself to sit in the discomfort of my own life instead of driving past it. Some nights were worse than others. I won't lie about that. There were evenings when the quiet pressed so hard on my chest I thought I might crack. On those nights, I'd take a walk, even in the cold, just to feel my body doing something useful. I learned the sound of my own footsteps again. And slowly, too slowly to feel heroic, my days stopped feeling like something I needed to escape from. Here's the part that surprised me. As I stabilized, a new fear showed up. Not loneliness. Irrelevance. I realized that if I kept my head down long enough, I could live out the rest of my life unnoticed. No drama. No pain. Just small, contained days. That option was suddenly very available. And I understood why some men take it. It looks safe from the outside. But safety isn't the same as living. One evening, months later, I ran into an old acquaintance at a grocery store. Nothing important. A few polite words. A nod. But as we talked, I noticed something that unsettled me more than the night in the truck. He spoke to me like I was already fading, like a man whose story had ended early. And I realized that if I accepted that version of myself, no one would argue. That was the moment I almost crossed a different line. The line where you stop expecting more from your own life. I went home and sat in that cheap chair, in that borrowed apartment, and made myself a quiet promise. Not to be happy. Not to be impressive. But to remain in the room. To take up space even when it felt undeserved. Because the truth is this, disappearing doesn't require losing everything. It only requires giving up the right to want more. And I wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. I'm ending here because this is where my life stopped shrinking and started resisting. What came next wasn't success and it wasn't love. It was something less dramatic and more dangerous. It was the slow return of self-respect, and the realization that one day, without planning it, I might be seen again. And when that day came, I needed to know who I was going to be standing there as. I didn't recognize them because they looked the same. I recognized them because my body reacted before my mind had time to catch up. That tightening in the chest. That quiet alertness. Like when you hear a sound at night and know without thinking that something doesn't belong. I was standing in line at a grocery store holding a basket with things I didn't need to think about. Bread, milk, something for dinner, when I saw them a few feet ahead of me. My ex-wife was slightly turned toward him, listening the way she used to listen to me when she still cared. My best friend stood close enough that there was no confusion left in the world. They were older. So was I. Time had done its work evenly but not kindly. In that first second, I understood something I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. I was curious in a way that felt dangerous. I wondered what they saw when they looked at me now. Because they did look. Not at the same time but close enough that I noticed. My ex-wife's eyes flicked toward me and then away, like she'd touched something hot. My best friend stared a fraction too long as if he were searching for permission. That's when I knew this moment mattered more to them than it did to me. And that realization came with a choice. I could turn my card and leave. Pretend I hadn't seen them. Keep my life undisturbed. Or I could stay exactly where I was and let whatever this was finish forming. I stayed. The cashier finished with the customer ahead of them, and suddenly there was nowhere else to look. My ex-wife turned fully toward me. Her face did something I recognized too well. It tried to arrange itself into something neutral. Polite. Careful. My best friend cleared his throat like he used to when he was nervous and didn't want to admit it. He said my name first. Softly. Like he wasn't sure he still had the right. Hearing it from his mouth again after all those years felt stranger than I expected. Not painful. Just misplaced. My ex-wife said hello next. Not my name. Just hello. I noticed that detail and filed it away without comment. Small things matter when you've lived long enough. We stood there, three people who shared a past no one around us could see. The cashier scanned items and asked routine questions. Bags were filled. Time moved forward without ceremony. That's the part no one tells you about moments like this, how ordinary they are on the surface. When there was finally space to speak, my best friend tried again. He said something about it being a long time. Something about how unexpected this was. The words were harmless. Almost friendly. That was when I realized something else that shifted the ground under my feet. They had rehearsed this moment. Not together, maybe, but in their own ways. They had imagined running into me. They had prepared lines. Explanations. Regrets. I hadn't. And that asymmetry gave me a strange kind of clarity. I didn't owe this moment anything. My ex-wife looked at me then, really looked, and I saw something I hadn't anticipated. Not guilt. Not longing. Assessment. She was trying to understand who I'd become without her. Whether the decision they made all those years ago still held its shape. That's when I felt the old instinct rise up, the one that had guided me for most of my life. Explain yourself. Be reasonable. Make it easier for everyone. And for a brief, dangerous second I considered it. I could tell them I was fine. I could tell them life worked out. I could offer forgiveness like a clean ending, something they could carry home and set down. But I caught myself. I realized that would still make this moment about them. So I did the only honest thing left. I said one sentence. Come. Even. Without emphasis. I said, I'm late for something. That was it. No bitterness. No warmth. No history attached. My best friend blinked, like he hadn't understood the language. My ex-wife's mouth opened slightly, as if she were about to add something important, something final. I didn't wait to hear it. I nodded once, not to them but to myself, and stepped around the cart. As I walked away, I felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not relief. Not triumph. Wait. The weight of finally not carrying their version of me anymore. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew, without turning, that they were standing there longer than necessary, watching me leave, trying to decide what this meant. And for the first time in 30 years, that question belonged entirely to them. I got to my car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I realized I hadn't won anything in that store. There was no score to settle. But something had shifted in a quieter way. I had passed a test I didn't know I'd been studying for. I'm ending this here because the story most people expect ends with a confrontation or a speech. Mine didn't. What came after that encounter wasn't about them at all. It was about what happens when a man realizes that silence, used correctly, can be louder than any last word. And how living with that silence changes everything that follows. I didn't feel lighter after that day in the grocery store. That surprised me. I thought something would lift, some old weight, some knot I'd been carrying for decades. But when I drove home, the road looked the same. The radio played the same songs. Traffic lights changed on their schedule, indifferent to my private milestone. That's the truth no one sells you about closure. When it happens for real, it doesn't announce itself. It just stops asking anything from you. That night, I made dinner the way I usually do now. Simple. Quiet. I ate at the small table by the window, watching the last light drain out of the sky. At one point I realized I hadn't replayed the encounter even once. Not his face. Not her voice. Not the moment I walked away. It had already moved out of the center of my mind. That's when I understood something important. The meeting hadn't given me power. It had taken something away, the need to carry them forward with me. For years I told myself I was past it. That time had done its job. But the truth was more uncomfortable. I hadn't been stuck in anger. I'd been stuck in readiness. Ready to explain. Ready to defend. Ready to prove that I hadn't been destroyed by what they did. And without realizing it, I'd been living as if one day I'd be called to the stand. That grocery store moment ended that trial. Not because I won, but because the courtroom closed. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes. I stopped editing my stories when I talked about the past. I stopped softening details to protect people who no longer needed protecting. I also stopped sharpening them. There was no audience left to impress. That kind of freedom is quiet, and if you're not careful, you can miss it entirely. One afternoon, I was cleaning out a drawer and found an old photograph. The three of us, years ago, smiling into a camera we trusted. I expected bitterness. What I felt was distance. Like looking at a house you used to live in on a street you no longer drive down. I didn't tear the photo up. I didn't put it back either. I set it aside, finished cleaning, and threw it away with the rest of the things that no longer had a place in my life. Not dramatically. Just honestly. That was the moment it finally clicked. The last word I got wasn't spoken. It was lived. It was the accumulation of ordinary days where I chose not to define myself by the worst thing that happened to me. I didn't become exceptional. I didn't get revenge. I didn't even become especially happy in a way people like to applaud. What I became was steady again, but this time for myself. If you're listening to this and waiting for the part where I tell you forgiveness is the answer, I won't. Forgiveness came and went in pieces like weather. Some days it showed up. Some days it didn't. It turned out not to be the point. The point was reclaiming the right to live without reference. To wake up without checking the past for permission. To walk through a store, a street, a memory and not brace for impact. That's the kind of peace no one notices from the outside. And that's exactly why it lasts. I don't know what became of them after that day. I truly don't. And that might be the most honest measure of where I ended up. They no longer occupy space in my questions. The man I am now doesn't need their regret to validate his survival. He doesn't need their understanding to move forward. He doesn't need a last word they can hear. If there's anything I've learned from living long enough to tell the story, it's this. Some endings don't close with a sound. They close when you stop waiting for one. And when that happens, you don't feel victorious. You feel finished, in the best possible way. I don't tell this story because I still need to. I tell it because one day I realized I no longer needed to, and that felt like something worth saying out loud. There was a time when I thought survival meant becoming harder, sharper, more guarded. I believed the only way to live through betrayal was to carry it like a weapon. Heavy, visible, always ready. I was wrong. What actually saved me was learning how to set it down. Not in a dramatic moment. Not with forgiveness or closure or some final understanding. Just by not picking it up again one ordinary morning. Life after all of this didn't turn into something impressive. It became something steady. I still wake up early. I still drink my coffee the same way. I still notice the quiet before the day starts. The difference is that the quiet no longer feels like absence. Feels like room. Space I'm allowed to occupy without explanation. I don't rehearse conversations in my head anymore. I don't prepare answers for questions no one is asking. I don't wonder what they might think if they saw me now. That curiosity used to live in me like a low-grade fever. It's gone. I've learned that time doesn't heal you by itself. What time really does is give you repeated chances to choose what you carry forward. Some men keep the injury. They polish it, revisit it, shape their identity around it. Others bury it so deep it poisons everything quietly. I did neither. I let it age. And like most things left alone long enough, it lost its power to command attention. There are still moments, of course. A familiar street. A voice that sounds almost right. A memory that arrives unannounced. But memories aren't enemies when you stop arguing with them. They come. They pass. They don't get to decide what kind of man I am today. If you're listening to this and you're still in the middle of it, still shrinking, still bracing, still waiting for something that never quite arrives, this isn't advice. It's just a report from further down the road. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to be louder, tougher, or better than anyone else. You just need to stay. In your life. In your body. In your days. That's harder than it sounds, and it matters more than most people will ever admit. I didn't get the last word because I spoke it. I got it because I stopped needing one. And when that happens, something settles in you that no one can take away. Not time. Not regret. Not even the past.